The emergency department is running at capacity. Gurneys in the hallway. A trauma bay with 3 people working in it simultaneously. The noise is controlled chaos, the kind hospitals absorb without blinking. A woman in blue scrubs moves through it without urgency and without hesitation. She checks an IV line, adjusts a monitor, speaks to a patient in a voice too quiet to hear from 3 feet away. She looks like she belongs to the furniture of the place. Badge clipped, low hair back. Nothing about her asks to be remembered. At the far end of the corridor, a man in a dark suit steps through the ambulance bay doors. He has the posture of someone who has never had to ask for directions. He scans the room the way people scan rooms when they are looking for a specific kind of problem. His eyes land on the nurse. He crosses toward her badge already in his hand and says something short, official. Fine. The nurse does not look at his badge. She looks at his face, calm, unhurried, the way someone looks at a situation they have already assessed and filed. Then she says something back, quietly, and the agent's expression changes. Not anger, not confusion. Something more careful than either. 3 hours later, a black SUV with no civilian plates pulls into the hospital's ambulance bay. 2 people step out who do not work for the FBI, do not introduce themselves to the front desk, and do not ask for directions. They ask for Mara. And the agent who spent the last 3 hours running this floor realizes, with the particular discomfort of a professional who has misread a room, that she was never the least important person in it. The emergency department at Harwick Regional Medical Center runs on a logic that looks like disorder from the outside and functions like a clock from the inside. Beds fill and empty. Alarms cycle. The overhead light is the same at 2 in the afternoon as it is at 2 in the morning, which means the staff learn to carry their own sense of time and apply it sparingly. Nurse Mara Voss has worked this floor for 14 months. She is 36, and she carries those years the way certain people carry age, not heavily, but with a compression that suggests more has happened inside them than a number accounts for. She does not talk about where she was before Harwick. People assume travel nursing, or burnout from a bigger city hospital, or a personal reason that is none of their business. She does not correct them. Silence, maintained long enough and consistently enough, becomes its own explanation. She is efficient in a way that does not look efficient. She does not rush. She does not announce herself. She appears where she is needed slightly before she is called, and she is gone again before the moment becomes a scene. The charge nurse, a man named Dupree who has worked this floor for 9 years, says she is the best nurse he has never been able to evaluate because she never gives him anything to write down. No incidents, no complaints, no citations, nothing remarkable. Which is, if you are paying attention, its own kind of remarkable. At 14:20, on a Tuesday, the ambulance bay doors open and 2 men walk in with a third between them. The third man is conscious but barely. He is approximately 50 years old, pale, sweating through a shirt that was expensive this morning and is ruined now. He is not speaking. One of the men holding him is wearing a jacket that is too structured for the weather, the kind of jacket that has been chosen for what it conceals, not what it displays. The other man's eyes do not go to the nurses or the desk. They go to the exit. They tell the triage nurse that the patient collapsed in a packing garage. They give a name, Doylem, and a date of birth that will later prove to be 18 months off. They say he has no known allergies. They say they will wait outside. They leave before anyone thinks to ask them for identification. And by the time someone does think to ask, the ambulance bay doors have already closed behind them. The patient is assigned a bay and handed to Mara. She takes his vitals, runs the standard intake, notes the blood pressure and the heart rate and the oxygen saturation. She checks his pupils. She looks at his hands. The callus is the specific kind of old scar tissue that sits along the web between thumb and forefinger on the right hand. She looks at his neck, where a very faint tattoo has been partially removed with a kind of care that suggests it was done properly and expensively. Not prison work, not amateur work, the kind of removal that happens when a professional identity is being deliberately retired. She does not react to any of this. She starts a line, draws blood, orders the standard workup, and writes in the chart what the chart requires. Presenting complaint, vitals, initial assessment. She writes it clearly and completely, because what you write in a chart is what happened, and what you do not write is not evidence of absence. She pages the attending physician, a young doctor named Carlyle, who arrives in 4 minutes and takes over with confident efficiency. Mara steps back. She hands him the chart. She goes to the next bay. But before she does 2 things that nobody knows. She memorizes the patient's right hand, the specific pattern of the scarring, the ink removal, the slight asymmetry of a healed fracture at the 4th metacarpal. She catalogs it the way someone catalogs a detail they expect to need later, and she checks the time, not on a phone, on the clock above bay 4, which she can see from the corridor. 14:31. She commits it to memory. She goes to the next patient. The department keeps moving. Alarm cycled. The overhead light stays the same. Special Agent Dana Reyes arrives at 15:44, which is 1 hour and 13 minutes after the patient was admitted, which is fast enough to mean she had a flag on the name or the description before the hospital knew he was there. She is 41, dressed in the particular way of federal agents who dress for authority and practicality simultaneously. Dark blazer, low heels, credentials in a wallet that opens with a single practiced motion. She is not unkind. She is efficient in the way that power is efficient when it does not expect resistance. She goes to the charge desk, shows her badge, states her business in 3 sentences, and asks for the nurse who processed the admission. Dupree points at Mara without ceremony. Reyes approaches her in the corridor between bays 3 and 4, where Mara is charting at a wall-mounted terminal. She opens the badge wallet again as she gets close. Standard procedure, or a habit, the kind that becomes identical over time. Agent Reyes, FBI, she says, you admitted a patient at approximately 14:20, male, 50s, brought in by 2 individuals who did not stay. Mara looks at her. Not at the badge, yes, she says. I need the chart. You need a release request through the attending or a court order, Mara says. Her tone is not hostile. It is the tone of someone explaining a process that exists for a reason and applies equally to everyone. Reyes does not blink. I have authorization, she says, and she produces a document that is legitimate, properly signed, and comprehensive enough to cover the request. Mara reads it, all of it. In the time it takes her to read it, Reyes' posture shifts a half degree, the small adjustment of someone accustomed to people moving faster than this. So will get. Dr. Carlyle, Mara says. She does. Carlyle reviews the authorization, signs the release, and gives Reyes access to the chart. Mara stands at the edge of the conversation and says nothing she is not asked to say. She answers Reyes' direct questions with direct answers. She volunteers nothing. Reyes asks, did the patient speak to you? Mara says, no. Reyes asks, did the men who brought him in give any information beyond what is in the chart? Mara says, no. Reyes asks, did anything about the admissions seem unusual to you? Mara looks at her for a moment. A beat that is not quite long enough to be suspicious but is precisely long enough to register. Patients arrive under unusual circumstances regularly in an emergency department, she says. I process what is in front of me. It is a perfect non-answer, technically complete, informationally empty. Reyes writes something in a small notebook and moves on. She establishes a position near the patient's bay, requests that the floor restrict access to authorized personnel only, and makes 2 phone calls in the corridor that she does not make quietly enough, which tells Mara everything she needs to know about how much Reyes respects the people around her. By 16:20, Reyes believes she has secured the situation. She has the chart, the attending's cooperation, a restricted access notation on the bay, and what she believes is a cooperative nursing staff. What she does not have is the picture Mara has already built in her head, the one assembled from the hand, the ink removal, the jacket angles of the 2 men, the time gap between admission and federal arrival, and 2 other details Reyes did not ask about and Mara did not offer. The first, the men who brought the patient in walked past 3 closer bays to reach Dupree's desk, which means they had been in the department before and knew the layout. The second, one of them, when he turned to leave, glanced at the ceiling, not at the overhead light, not at the exit sign, at the camera. Mara finished charting at 16:24 and clocked out for a 40-minute break she did not take. At 17:09, the patient in Bay 6 still listed in the system under the provisional name Harwick M. Doe, because the name Doyle had not been formally verified. He showed a change in his condition that did not fit his presenting complaint. He had come in with what was charted as a syncopal episode, a loss of consciousness consistent with a vascular event, possibly dehydration-related, possibly cardiac. His initial workup was unremarkable in the way that keeps physicians cautious. Nothing definitively wrong, nothing definitively right. He had been stabilized and placed on continuous monitoring pending lab results and specialist review. The change at 17:09 was in his heart rhythm, not a dramatic change, not the kind that trips alarms and brings a team running. A subtle arrhythmia, a pattern of P-wave morphology alterations that suggested pharmacological interference rather than organic cardiac disease. The kind of change that a physician seeing the tracing for the first time would note is interesting. The kind of change that someone who had seen it before, in a different context, in a different kind of setting, would recognize as a signature. Mara was not assigned to Bay 6. She was covering the adjacent corridor when she passed the monitoring station and saw the tracing on the secondary screen. She stopped. She looked at it for 4 seconds. Then she went to find Dr. Carlyle. She gave him a specific clinical description of what she had observed and a differential that included pharmacological interference as a primary consideration rather than an afterthought. Carlyle looked at her for a moment with the expression, physicians, sometimes used when a nurse speaks outside the expected register. Then he looked at the tracing. Then he ordered the additional blood panel she suggested without being asked to. She did not tell him why. She recognized the pattern. She did not tell him what it meant about who the patient was or what had been done to him. She gave him the information that was clinically useful and let him reach his own conclusions inside the framework that was available to him. What she knew, and what she did not say, was this. The pattern on that monitor was not spontaneous. It was the result of a compound introduced at a low dose over a period of time, a compound that produced this specific arrhythmia in this specific progression. And that was used in a very narrow category of operational applications because it was difficult to detect in standard toxicology panels. metabolized quickly, and produced effects that a hospital emergency department was very likely to attribute to cardiac disease rather than interference. She had seen it once before, not in a hospital, not in a chart, in a briefing that she was not going to think about, in a hospital corridor. She went back to her station and picked up the next patient's file. At 17:34, she made a call from the staff bathroom on a phone that did not belong to the hospital and did not belong to the number her employer had on file. The call lasted 40 seconds. She gave a location, a patient description, a time of admission, a physical detail that served as a verification marker, the right hand, the ink removal, the fourth metacarpal, and a 3-word assessment of the situation status. Then she flushed the phone's temporary SIM card, pocketed the handset, and returned to the floor. At 17:51, the blood panel results came back with an anomaly that Carlyle flagged immediately and called the attending cardiologist about. The anomaly was consistent with Mara's suggested differential. It was not consistent with anything that should have appeared in a parking garage collapse case. Reyes was notified at 17:58. She went into the bay to look at the patient and came out looking different than she had gone in, not alarmed, but recalibrated. She made a phone call of her own, this one quieter than the previous ones. Mara watched her from the nurse's station without watching her. The threat was not coming from outside the hospital. The two men who had walked past 3 available bays to reach Dupree's desk, they had known the layout. They had looked at the camera. They had placed the patient in this building, in this department, in a bay that sat in a camera blind spot between the main overhead and the corridor secondary unit. Whoever wanted this patient dead was not waiting outside. They had already been inside, and they had left something behind that was still working. Agent Reyes returned to the floor at 18:30 with different energy. Not the controlled efficiency of a federal agent processing a scene, the tighter energy of one who has received updated information, and is now managing a problem that has grown larger than its original shape. She had a supervisor on the phone. She had a hospital legal representative who had materialized from somewhere in the administrative offices with a clipboard and the expression of a person whose evening had been rearranged. She had a revised authorization that expanded her access to the floor, the records, system, and the staff. She found Mara at the medication station and spoke to her directly. "You are being reassigned off this patient's care," she said. "Administrative decision agreed with hospital legal. It is precautionary." "I understand," Mara said. Reyes studied her for a moment, the same moment she had studied her before, but now with different data behind it. Mara had identified a pharmacological interference in a patient's cardiac tracing before the lab confirmed it. She had named a differential that turned out to be correct. She had done it calmly, without theater, without explanation of how she knew. "You have a background in toxicology?" Reyes asked. "I have a background in emergency nursing," Mara said. The answer was true. It was also, in the way Mara's answers tended to be, not the complete version of the truth. Reyes moved on. She had a floor to secure and she believed correctly, as far as her information went, that the threat was now contained. The patient had been moved to a more secure bay. The blood panel had identified the compound. The attending cardiologist had a treatment protocol in place. FBI presence on the floor had been increased by 2 agents who were now positioned at the corridor access points. What Reyes' information did not include was the element that Mara had identified at 17:09 and had not yet found the right moment to address, through channels that would actually reach someone with the authority to act on it. The compound in the patient's system was not a single-dose administration. It was part of a sequence. The first phase produced the arrhythmia that would bring him to a hospital. The second phase was designed to be administered in the hospital, specifically in the kind of setting where an IV line was already running and access to the medication supply was a function of system credentials, not physical presence. Someone with hospital access credentials had been in the system. Mara had checked the medication access logs at 17:45, while Carlyle was on the phone with cardiology. She had found an access pattern that did not belong to a pharmacy. Credential used to query the patient's medication chart from a terminal in the hospital's east wing that should have been idle. The query was brief, targeted, and consistent with someone confirming what was in the patient's current IV line before making a decision. She had flagged it to Dupree as a potential credential anomaly requiring a review. Dupree had submitted the ticket. The IT review was sitting in a queue with an estimated response time of 4 to 6 hours. 4 to 6 hours was longer than the patient had. Mara was now officially off his case. She had no clinical authority to re-enter his bay, no administrative standing to escalate the credential anomaly faster than the queue, and no institutional basis for telling an FBI agent that her perimeter was in the wrong place. She stood at the medication station and did the math that the situation required. The FBI was watching the doors. The hospital's security was watching the corridor access points. The cardiologist was watching the tracing. Nobody was watching the medication delivery system from the inside, because nobody in this building, except Mara, understood what the second phase of the compound sequence looked like in an IV context. She could step away. She had done what the system asked. She had flagged the anomaly. She had given Carlyle the differential. She had made the call. She had no further formal obligation to this patient. She thought about that for approximately 4 seconds. Then she did something that cost her the professional protection of having followed every rule. She went to the East Wing terminal herself, pulled up the credential access log on her own login, and spent 11 minutes building a complete access map of who had touched this patient's data, when, and from where. She was suspended pending review before the shift ended. Reyes informed her personally, and to her credit she did not use a pleasant tone to do it. You accessed restricted system data without authorization, she said. Everything you pulled is now potentially inadmissible. Mara looked at her. Did someone review the East Wing terminal, she asked. Reyes paused. That is under investigation. Did someone check the patient's current IV bag against the original pharmacy order? Another pause. Longer. Mara waited. Reyes turned and walked quickly toward Bay 6. The IV bag was wrong. Not dramatically, not a different drug, not a different label. The concentration was different. A pharmacological adjustment so precise it required either a pharmacy-level credential or the knowledge of someone who had worked with this specific compound before. The swap had been made in a 12-minute window that the cameras had not covered because of the blind spot. Reyes had her agents replace the line within 3 minutes of seeing the bag. She came back to the corridor where Mara was still standing. She did not apologize. She did not thank her. She looked at her with the expression of someone who is recalculating a room they thought they understood. You are still suspended pending review, she said. Mara nodded once. Do not leave the building, Reyes added. Mara said nothing. She found a chair near the nurse's station and sat down. She folded her hands in her lap. She waited with the particular stillness of someone who is not waiting because they have nothing to do but because the next piece of this is not theirs to move. In 1947, the ambulance bay doors opened. The vehicle was a black Chevrolet Suburban with government plates that did not correspond to any fleet registered to the FBI, the D, the ATF, or any agency whose vehicles were familiar to a federal agent working a regional hospital in a mid-sized American city. It pulled into the ambulance bay cleanly, without speed, the way vehicles driven by people who have driven into sensitive locations many times before arrive, with the specific unhurriedness of people who do not need to rush because everything that matters already knows they are coming. 2 people got out, a man and a woman, both in civilian clothes that had the same quality as Reyes' blazer chosen for function and authority simultaneously. No visible credentials. No introductions at the front desk. They came through the ambulance bay doors, paused for exactly the amount of time it takes to read a room, and then moved toward the nurse's station with the focused direction of people who already know where they are going. The man spoke to Dupree. He said one sentence. He asked for Mara. He used her first name, and then he said a second name, not the name on her badge. Not the name in Harwick Regional Medical Center's employment records. Not the name her colleagues used, a different name. Said quietly, in the particular way of a code word that functions as a credential. Dupree turned and looked at Mara, who was already standing. She had heard it from across the station. She walked toward them without urgency, without expression. In the same unhurried way she had moved through this floor for 14 months. The overhead light did not change. The alarms continued their cycle. The department kept running at its particular speed. Agent Reyes appeared from the direction of Bay 6 as Mara reached the 2 arrivals. She took in the vehicle through the bay window, the lack of introductions, the way the staff, Dupree, the triage nurse, even the security officer at the corridor entrance, had all subtly shifted posture in the past 45 seconds without knowing why. Who are you with? Reyes asked the man. He looked at her, not dismissively, not aggressively. The way a senior official looks at a junior one when the answer is self-evident to everyone who has the relevant clearance. You can make a call, he said. He gave her a number. Not an agency. Not a name. A number. Reyes looked at it. Then at Mara. Mara's expression had not changed. It had not become proud, or satisfied, or relieved. It was the same expression she wore when she was reading a chart or adjusting a monitor. Neutral. Present. Focused on the next thing that needed to be done. The woman who had arrived with the man spoke to Mara directly. She gave her a brief status update in low, specific language. The kind of language that does not belong to hospitals or FBI field offices but to a different institutional register entirely. One built around operational status and asset security and terminology that made Reyes, listening from 3 feet away, feel the specific discomfort of standing in a room where the vocabulary has just changed and nobody translated it for her. The U.S. Marshals Service's Witness Security Program, operating since 1971, has protected more than 19,000 witnesses and family members, whose lives were in danger as a result of their cooperation with federal investigations. The program is administered by the Department of Justice and operated by the Marshals Service, which provides security, relocation, and, when necessary, placement of protective personnel in positions that allow close-access monitoring of high-value witnesses in active threat environments. The program's operational security is absolute. Its personnel do not announce themselves, do not coordinate with parallel federal agencies unless necessary, and do not explain their presence to anyone without the relevant clearance to receive the explanation. The patient in Bay 6, the man who had arrived as Doyle M. and been admitted as Harwick M. Dew when the name failed verification, was not a cardiac patient who had collapsed in a parking garage. He was a federal witness inside an active protective placement. The 2 men who had brought him in were not associates. They were part of a compromised protective detail. compromised at a level that had allowed the first phase of the compound sequence to be administered before the collapse, and that had made a hospital the safest available location to bring him, because hospitals are the one environment where a second attempt requires internal access rather than external force. Mara's placement at Harwick Regional was not accidental. It had never been shift work. She was the class access monitor. She was the second layer. She was the person who would recognize the compound's signature in a tracing, who would flag the credential anomaly in the access logs, who would identify the 4-bag swap before it completed its purpose, because she had been placed in this building, on this floor, in this badge and these scrubs, specifically because the asset she was protecting might one day end up in this department. The system had worked, imperfectly and expansively and at the cost of her suspension and the near success of a second attempt, but it had worked. Reyes made the call to the number she had been given. She was on it for 90 seconds. When she ended it, she stood still for a moment with the expression of a professional who has just had their understanding of a situation replaced by a different and considerably larger one. She looked at Mara. "How long have you been here?" she asked. 14 months, Mara said. Reyes processed that. The whole time. Mara did not confirm or deny. She looked at the woman who had arrived in the SUV and received a small nod, the kind that communicates a status, not a sentiment. The man was already moving toward Base 6 with the particular authority of someone whose arrival is the conclusion of a process that began long before tonight. Mara turned back to Reyes. There was nothing hostile in her face, and nothing apologetic. Just the even-keeled clarity of a person who has done what the situation required and is now ready to move to the next thing. "Is there anything you need from me for your report?" Mara asked. Reyes studied her for a moment. Then, professionally, because she was good at her job even when her job had just been made to look smaller than it was, "We will need a full statement." "I will give you one," Mara said. "After I finish my shift." Reyes blinked. "You are suspended." "The suspension is pending review," Mara said. "The review will close tonight." She paused. "I still have 4 patients." She picked up a chart from the nurse's station. She went back to work. The department kept running. The overhead light did not change. 3 bays down. A monitor alarmed and a nurse responded, and the ordinary, necessary work of keeping people alive continued, without acknowledgement of what had just happened in the corridor beside it. Dupree watched Mara move to the next bay, then looked at the ambulance bay window, then back at his desk. He picked up his pen. He made a note in the assignment log. He did not write anything that would have explained what he had just watched. He wrote, "Voss for patients. Remainder of shift." He went back to work. The black SUV stayed in the ambulance bay. By morning, it would be gone, and Mara Voss, badge clipped low, hair back. Nothing about her asking to be remembered would be first in for the next shift.